I've sown my oats. Now I'm ready to be a real husband. That was the text Daniel sent me at 12:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, as if 35 years of marriage were a field he had casually wandered through and finally decided to come back to harvest. I was standing barefoot in my kitchen when my phone lit up, the glow reflecting off the stainless steel refrigerator we picked out together a decade ago. The house was quiet except for the steady hum of the dishwasher and the ticking clock above the stove. I read the message twice. Then a third time. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to feel exactly what it didn't make me feel anymore. No shock. No tears. Just clarity. Daniel had left 3 months earlier, saying he needed space to figure out who he was beyond being a husband and a father. At 64 years old, apparently that meant renting a downtown condo and rediscovering a version of himself that didn't include me. I remembered the afternoon he packed a suitcase. He folded his shirts neatly, like he was going on a business trip. He kissed the air near my cheek and said, "This isn't about you, Margaret." I had nodded. I didn't beg. I didn't ask who she was, even though I already knew there was someone. A woman from his gym, younger, energetic, someone who laughed too loudly at his stories. I had seen the change long before he walked out. The new cologne. The sudden interest in fitted jackets. The way he turned his phone face down on the counter. I wasn't blind. I was patient. That night, after reading his message, I set my phone down on the granite countertop and poured myself a glass of water. My hand didn't shake. The ice cubes clinked softly against the glass, a small, ordinary sound in a house that had learned how to be still without him. He thought I had been waiting. That I had spent these months frozen in place, staring at the driveway, hoping his car would pull in. But while he was sowing his oats, I was doing something else entirely. I was learning how to breathe in rooms that no longer echoed with his voice. I was meeting with a financial advisor for the first time in my life, sitting across from a young man who called me ma'am and explained compound interest like I had never balanced a checkbook before. I was sorting through decades of paperwork, realizing how many accounts had only his name attached. I was opening a new one under mine. The first time I signed just Margaret Whitmore, without the quiet assumption that Daniel stood beside me, I felt something shift. Not anger. Not revenge. Just ownership. I walked through the living room and paused by the family photos on the mantel. There we were at the Grand Canyon, wind whipping my hair across my face. There we were at Ethan's college graduation, Daniel's arm wrapped tightly around my shoulders. We had built a life measured in road trips, mortgage payments, and Sunday dinners. It hadn't been perfect, but it had been real. And now he was texting me like I was an option he had finally decided to circle back to. I picked up my phone again and looked at his words. Now I'm ready. Ready for what? For stability. For the comfort of someone who knew how he took his coffee and where he kept his blood pressure medication. I didn't type back. Instead, I walked to the front door and checked the lock, a habit I'd developed since he left. Not out of fear. Out of awareness. This house was mine too. The mortgage had been paid off last year. The garden out back, the one with the stubborn rosebush that refused to bloom for 3 seasons, had finally started showing color. I had trimmed it myself in early spring, kneeling on the damp grass with pruning shears and a quiet determination. Growth doesn't happen because someone comes back. It happens because you tend to what's still rooted. Daniel believed this text was a beginning. He had no idea it was arriving at the end of something entirely different. The next morning I woke before sunrise, the way I had done for most of my adult life, except this time there was no second pillow creased beside mine and no low murmur of the morning news drifting in from the living room. The house felt steady, almost expectant, as if it too had adjusted to the rhythm of one heartbeat instead of 2. I lay there for a moment staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, thinking about how strange it was that a single sentence could arrive months late and still expect to rearrange everything. I have sown my oats. Now I am ready. Ready was a word Daniel used often when he wanted to feel decisive. Ready to start a new business. Ready to move to a bigger house. Ready to try a new church. It always sounded confident, but it usually meant he had already made a choice and simply wanted everyone else to catch up. I slipped out of bed and padded down the hallway, passing the guest room he once claimed he needed while he was figuring things out. The bed in there was still made tight, hospital corners tucked in from the day I changed the sheets after he left. I never unmade it again. In the kitchen, I measured coffee grounds carefully, 2 level tablespoons for 1 cup, just as I liked it, and waited for the machine to finish its cycle. The smell filled the air, warm and grounding. I used to make his coffee first, strong and dark, set beside his favorite mug with the faded logo from his old consulting firm. That mug now sat in the back of the cabinet. I did not throw it away. I simply stopped reaching for it. 3 months is long enough to notice patterns. The first month after he left, I moved through the house like a guest, careful not to disturb anything. The second month, I started rearranging small things. I donated his stack of old magazines to the library. I cleared out half of the garage shelves. I scheduled the furnace inspection he had postponed for years. The third month was different. That was when I sat down at the dining room table with a yellow legal pad and wrote down every bill, every account, every asset tied to our names. I discovered that while he was searching for himself, I was rediscovering the structure of our life. The mortgage statement, the retirement accounts, the insurance policies. I made copies. I opened my own savings account at a branch bank 3 miles from the house. The young teller congratulated me as if I had just achieved something small but brave. I suppose in a way I had. When our son Ethan called 2 weeks after Daniel moved out, his voice carried a careful tone, the kind people use when they are trying not to step on glass. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was managing. He did not defend his father, but he did not criticize him either. That was his way. I did not ask where Daniel was staying. I already knew from a mutual friend that it was a high-rise apartment overlooking the river, complete with a fitness center and rooftop patio. It sounded temporary, like a vacation rental someone convinces themselves is permanent. Now, with that text glowing in my memory, I understood something else. Daniel believed time had paused for me. That while he explored a different version of his life, mine had remained suspended in waiting. But I had not been waiting. I had been building something quieter and far more durable. I took my coffee to the back porch and sat in the wooden chair he once promised to refinish. The early morning air carried the scent of damp soil and trimmed grass. The rosebush near the fence caught the first light, its petals opening without asking anyone for permission. I thought about his words again, about the confidence behind them, and I felt no urgency to respond. If he was ready now, it was only because he assumed I would always be there. What he did not yet understand was that readiness works both ways, and I was already further along than he could see. Daniel did not send another message that night, and I did not offer one either. Silence can feel heavy when it is forced, but when it is chosen, it becomes something else entirely. I carried my phone with me through the day, not because I was waiting, but because I was observing myself. I wanted to know if there was any part of me that still flinched at his name lighting up the screen. There was not. Instead, there was a calm awareness, the kind that settles in after a long storm when you realize the roof has held. That afternoon I drove to the bank again, the same branch 3 miles from the house, and requested a printed summary of my accounts. The paper felt crisp between my fingers, rows of numbers lined up neatly under my name. My name alone. For decades, financial statements had arrived addressed to Daniel or to both of us, his first, mine second. It was a small detail, but small details have weight. I sat in my car for a moment before turning the key in the ignition, remembering the early years of our marriage when money was tight and we measured groceries down to the last dollar. We built our life carefully. I worked part-time while Ethan was young, then full-time once he entered middle school. I handled school schedules, doctor appointments, and holiday dinners. Daniel handled investments and retirement planning. At least that was the division we agreed on. I trusted him because trust was the foundation we claimed to stand on. Looking back, I realized how often I had deferred, how many times I accepted, "It is taken care of," without asking to see what taken care of actually meant. 3 weeks after he moved out, I found an unopened envelope in his desk drawer. It contained a statement for a separate credit card account I had never seen before. The balance was not small. I did not confront him. By then he was already gone, busy rediscovering himself in a downtown apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the river. Instead, I scheduled a consultation with an attorney recommended by a neighbor who had finalized her own divorce the year before. I remember sitting across from that attorney, a woman about my age with silver hair pulled into a low bun, explaining the situation without drama. She listened carefully, hands folded on the desk, and said, "Margaret, you have more options than you think." Options. That word stayed with me. Not revenge. Not punishment. Options. I gathered documents methodically over the next several weeks. Tax returns from the past 5 years. Retirement account statements. Property records. I made copies and stored them in a small fireproof box in my closet. I did not rush. I did not panic. I simply prepared. Daniel's text had arrived as if he were announcing the end of a brief experiment. He believed he could close one chapter and reopen another without consequence. What he did not know was that I had already drafted my own chapter. As I pulled into the driveway that afternoon, I noticed the lawn needed trimming. He used to handle that every Saturday morning, pushing the mower in straight lines with quiet pride. I walked into the garage, checked the gas can, and started the mower myself. The vibration traveled up through my hands and into my arms, steady and grounding. The scent of freshly cut grass filled the air. Neighbors waved as they passed, unaware of the quiet transformation taking place behind my front door. By the time the sun began to set, the yard looked neat, orderly, maintained. I wiped sweat from my forehead and allowed myself a small, satisfied breath. Later that evening, as I placed the attorney's business card inside my nightstand drawer, I understood something clearly. Daniel believed he was returning to the version of me he left behind. The woman who accommodated. The woman who waited. But the woman standing in this house now had read every statement, signed her own forms, and learned the difference between being chosen and choosing herself. His message had been an invitation. What he did not realize was that I had already responded in ways he could not yet see. 2 days after Daniel sent that message, he called. I watched his name appear on the screen while I was folding laundry in the living room, sunlight stretching across the hardwood floors in long, quiet lines. For a moment, I let the phone ring. Not to be dramatic. Just to feel the difference between reacting and deciding. When I answered, his voice carried that familiar confidence, the one he used in board meetings and neighborhood barbecues. He asked how I was, as if 3 months of absence could be summarized in a polite question. I told him I was doing well. There was a pause on the other end, a small recalibration. He said he had been thinking. He said he had made mistakes. He said he had needed to get certain things out of his system so he could fully commit again. The words were smooth, almost rehearsed. I stood there holding a neatly folded towel, noticing how easily he framed his departure as a necessary chapter rather than a choice that disrupted an entire household. He spoke about clarity, about realizing what truly mattered, about understanding that home was not a downtown apartment with a view of the river but the house on Maple Ridge Drive with the blue shutters and the rosebush by the fence. He said he missed our routine. He missed the quiet dinners. He missed the stability. What he did not say was that the woman he had been spending time with had likely moved on. He did not mention the separate credit card balance or the expenses that had accumulated while he was rediscovering himself. I listened without interrupting. Years ago, I would have rushed to fill the silence, to reassure him that everything could be repaired if we just tried harder. Now I let the silence remain intact. When he finally asked if we could meet and talk in person, I agreed. Not because I was persuaded. Because I was prepared. We settled on Saturday afternoon. He suggested we meet at the house. I agreed again. After I ended the call, I did not collapse into doubt. Instead, I walked to my desk and opened the folder I had labeled Simply Personal. Inside were copies of the financial statements, the consultation notes from the attorney, and a draft petition for divorce that had been completed but not yet filed. I ran my fingers along the edge of the paper, feeling its quiet weight. Preparation has a different texture than anger. It is steadier. On Friday evening, our son Ethan called. His voice carried concern, careful and restrained. He told me his father had mentioned reaching out. I assured him I was fine. I did not ask for his opinion, and he did not offer one. I could sense that he was navigating his own loyalties, trying to love both parents without choosing sides. I respected that. This was not a battle. It was a reckoning. Saturday arrived clear and mild, 72 degrees with a light breeze moving through the trees. I cleaned the kitchen that morning, not out of nervousness, but out of habit. The countertops shone. The floors were swept. The house did not look abandoned or desperate. It looked lived in and maintained. Around 2 in the afternoon, I heard the familiar sound of his car pulling into the driveway. My heart did not race. It steadied. I glanced at my reflection in the hallway mirror, noticing the lines around my eyes, the silver threading through my hair. I did not look diminished. I looked experienced. When the doorbell rang, I took a slow breath and walked to the front door. Daniel stood there holding a small bouquet of white lilies, dressed in a pressed button-down shirt as if attending a formal apology. For a brief second, I saw the man I had once trusted without question. Then I saw the distance of the past 3 months layered over him like dust. I opened the door fully and stepped aside to let him enter, aware that whatever conversation was about to unfold, it would not return me to where I had been. It would simply confirm how far I had already moved. Daniel stepped inside slowly, as if he expected the air itself to resist him. He handed me the bouquet of lilies with a careful smile, the kind meant to signal humility. I accepted them, thanked him, and placed them in a glass vase on the kitchen counter. The scent was light, almost polite. He stood in the center of the living room for a moment, taking in the familiar furniture, the framed photographs, the quiet order of a space that had not fallen apart in his absence. I gestured toward the dining table, and we sat across from each other, the same place where we had shared thousands of meals and ordinary conversations. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he began. He talked about clarity, about realizing that what he thought he needed was not what truly mattered. He said the excitement of something new had faded quickly. He said he missed stability, missed history, missed being understood without explanation. His words moved in careful circles, never landing too heavily on responsibility. I listened, hands folded loosely in front of me. I did not challenge his version of events. I did not ask about the woman from the gym or the apartment overlooking the river. Those details no longer carried the sharpness they once might have. Instead, I asked a simple question. I asked him what exactly he believed would happen now. He looked momentarily surprised, as if the outcome were obvious. He said he thought we could start fresh, that we had too much invested to throw away, that marriage was about working through seasons. He leaned forward slightly, voice softer, and said he was ready to be fully present this time. Ready. There was that word again. I studied his face, noticing the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the silver in his hair that had grown more noticeable over the past year. He looked older than he had 3 months ago, as if whatever he had been chasing had cost him more than he anticipated. I stood up and walked to the sideboard, opening the drawer where I kept important documents. When I returned to the table, I placed a thin folder between us. His eyes flickered down to it, then back to me. I told him calmly that while he was discovering what he wanted, I had taken steps to protect myself. I explained that I had met with an attorney. That I had reviewed our finances. That I had prepared paperwork in case reconciliation was not the right path. He did not reach for the folder immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, processing. He asked if I was serious. I told him I was careful. There is a difference. I explained that trust is not restored by intention alone. It is rebuilt by consistency, by transparency, by accountability. I said that if he truly wished to return, there would be conditions. Full financial disclosure. Joint counseling. Clear boundaries. No vague language about space or self-discovery. I spoke evenly, without accusation. The tone surprised him more than anger would have. He finally opened the folder and glanced at the documents inside. The draft petition for divorce rested on top, unsigned but complete. He looked up at me, a mixture of disbelief and recognition settling in his expression. For the first time since he walked through the door, he seemed to understand that he was not stepping back into a paused life. He was sitting across from someone who had continued moving forward. I told him I was not punishing him. I was choosing myself. If he wished to be part of my future, it would not be because he was ready. It would be because I decided he was worthy of standing beside the woman I had become. The room felt steady, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the floor. Daniel closed the folder slowly, as if aware that whatever happened next would not be dictated by his readiness alone. Daniel did not argue right away. He closed the folder carefully, as if the paper inside might cut him, and rested his hands on the table. The confidence he carried into the house had softened into something quieter, something closer to uncertainty. He asked how long I had been considering this. I told him the truth. Since the second week after he left. Not out of anger, but out of awareness. I explained that when someone walks away from a 35-year marriage in search of clarity, the person left behind has two choices. Collapse or calculate. I chose to calculate. He looked around the room again, noticing details he had probably never paid attention to before. The freshly painted trim near the hallway. The new lock on the back door. The absence of his stack of unopened mail on the corner table. He asked if I had already filed the petition. I told him not yet. It was prepared, not executed. That distinction mattered. Prepared meant I had accepted the possibility. Not executed meant I had not rushed. He nodded slowly, absorbing the difference. Then he began to speak more honestly. He admitted that the apartment felt exciting at first. That the independence he thought he wanted felt empowering for a few weeks. He described late dinners downtown, spontaneous plans, a version of himself that did not revolve around shared routines. But he also admitted that novelty fades quickly when it is not anchored to something meaningful. The woman he had been seeing had expectations of her own, expectations that did not include managing blood pressure prescriptions or discussing retirement projections. He said he realized he missed partnership, not performance. I listened without judgment. His words were not shocking. They were predictable. Life at 64 is different than life at 24. Energy shifts. Priorities surface. I asked him if he understood that what he called a season had been a fracture for me. He lowered his eyes and said yes. He said he had underestimated the impact. That he assumed I would remain steady and waiting. There it was again. The assumption. I told him gently that steadiness does not mean stillness. While he was measuring freedom, I was measuring risk. While he was exploring options, I was securing stability. I explained that the attorney had outlined several scenarios, including legal separation and structured reconciliation agreements. His eyebrows lifted slightly at that phrase. Structured reconciliation. I told him it meant rebuilding trust through documented transparency. Shared access to financial accounts. Monthly counseling sessions. A written agreement about future conduct. He asked if I truly believed paperwork could restore a marriage. I answered that paperwork does not restore trust. It protects the person who chooses to offer it again. The late afternoon light shifted, casting the room in a softer hue. He looked older in that light, less certain. For the first time, he did not frame his return as a favor or an awakening. He framed it as a request. He said he did not want to lose what we built. I told him calmly that what we built had already changed. The foundation was not gone, but it was cracked. Repair requires effort from both sides, and repair does not guarantee restoration. I stood and walked to the kitchen, pouring 2 glasses of water. I handed one to him. My hands remained steady. I told him I would not make a decision that day. He would need to reflect, not just on his readiness, but on his responsibility. If he chose to move forward under the conditions I outlined, we could begin slowly, deliberately. If he hesitated, I would file the petition without hesitation. There was no threat in my voice. Only clarity. Daniel nodded, absorbing the weight of a choice that no longer belonged solely to him. In the quiet that followed, I understood something deeply. For the first time in decades, the direction of my life was not being negotiated from a place of fear. It was being decided from a place of strength. Daniel left just before sunset, carrying the folder with him as if it were heavier than the bouquet he had brought. I watched through the front window as he paused beside his car, one hand resting on the roof, staring at nothing in particular. For years I would have rushed outside, softened the edges, reassured him that everything would be fine. Instead, I let the curtain fall back into place and turned toward the quiet of my own living room. The house did not feel tense. It felt settled. That evening I did not replay every word of our conversation the way I might have in the past. I made a simple dinner, grilled salmon and steamed green beans, and ate at the kitchen table with the radio playing softly in the background. Ordinary sounds filled the space. The clink of a fork against a plate. The low hum of the refrigerator. The world had not shifted dramatically. It had simply clarified. 2 days passed without a message from him. On the 3rd morning, my phone vibrated while I was watering the rosebush near the fence. The sunlight was warm, the air carrying the faint scent of cut grass from a neighbor's yard. I wiped my hands on a towel and read his text carefully. He wrote that he had reviewed the documents. That he had met with his own financial advisor. That he was willing to provide full disclosure of every account, every debt, every investment. He said he would attend counseling. He said he understood that rebuilding would require structure, not promises. The tone was different from his first message. Less pride. More humility. I did not respond immediately. I finished watering the garden, coiled the hose neatly, and returned inside. There is power in choosing the pace of your reply. Later that afternoon, I sat at my desk and opened the folder labeled personal. I reviewed the draft petition once more, reading each line slowly. It did not feel like a threat anymore. It felt like an anchor. A reminder that I had options not because I wanted to escape, but because I refused to be cornered. I called the attorney and scheduled a follow-up consultation for the following week. Not to file. To reassess. That evening Daniel called instead of texting. His voice sounded measured. He said he had canceled the lease on the apartment. He had begun transferring funds into a joint account with full transparency. He asked if he could come by again, not to move back in, but to talk through next steps. I listened, noting the difference in his tone. He was not announcing readiness. He was requesting consideration. I told him we would proceed slowly. That he would not move back into the house immediately. That counseling would begin first. That financial access would remain open and mutual. He agreed without argument. After the call ended, I stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the framed photograph of us at the Grand Canyon. The image did not feel like a lie. It felt like a chapter. Chapters can be revisited, but they cannot be relived exactly as they were. Later that night, as I prepared for bed, I realized something quietly profound. Whether Daniel stayed or left permanently, my foundation would not shift the way it once would have. I had rebuilt my sense of security from the inside out. I had learned the language of accounts and legal documents. I had practiced the art of calm boundaries. When I turned off the bedside lamp, the room felt peaceful, not uncertain. Whatever happened next would not be dictated by his return. It would be shaped by my standards. And for the first time in decades, that realization felt like enough. A week later Daniel returned, not with flowers this time, but with a thin leather portfolio tucked under his arm. The air outside had turned cooler, early autumn settling in with a faint crispness that carried through the open windows. He stepped into the house quietly, almost respectfully, as if aware that entry was no longer automatic. We sat at the dining table again, the same place where everything now seemed to unfold. He opened the portfolio and began laying out printed statements one by one. Retirement accounts, investment portfolios, credit card balances, the lease termination agreement for the apartment. There was no dramatic speech this time. No polished phrases about readiness. Only numbers, facts, and a measured tone. He explained each account carefully, answering questions before I had to ask them. I listened and reviewed the documents without rushing. I noticed small things. Transfers that had already been made into our joint account. The cancellation of subscriptions tied to the downtown address. Evidence of effort, not just intention. When he finished, he looked at me with something I had not seen in months. Not confidence. Not charm. Vulnerability. He said he had scheduled the first counseling session for the following Thursday at 10 in the morning. He handed me the appointment confirmation printed neatly from his email. I studied it briefly and nodded. Structure. That was what I had asked for. Structure leaves less room for convenient forgetting. We discussed practical matters next. He would not move back into the master bedroom immediately. If reconciliation progressed, we would revisit living arrangements after several sessions. He agreed without hesitation. The conversation felt less like a negotiation and more like a blueprint. Later that evening, after he left, I walked through the house slowly. The hallway, the living room, the kitchen. Each space felt familiar yet newly claimed. The draft petition for divorce still rested in my nightstand drawer, unchanged. I had not torn it up. I had not hidden it. It remained there as a reminder that my stability did not depend on his behavior alone. The following Thursday we sat side by side in a softly lit counseling office, neutral walls and a small fountain murmuring quietly in the corner. The counselor, a woman with calm eyes and steady posture, asked us to describe what trust meant to each of us. Daniel spoke about transparency and commitment. When it was my turn, I said trust meant not being treated as a fallback plan. The words settled in the room with quiet clarity. Daniel did not interrupt. He did not defend. He listened. Over the next several weeks, patterns emerged. He answered questions directly. He provided passwords without resistance. He acknowledged the impact of his choices without reframing them as personal growth exercises. I observed carefully, not suspiciously, but attentively. Rebuilding is not dramatic. It is repetitive. Small consistent actions stacked over time. One Saturday afternoon, as we reviewed household bills together at the kitchen table, I realized something subtle but powerful. I was not monitoring him out of fear. I was participating out of partnership. That distinction mattered. The power dynamic had shifted, not because I demanded control, but because I demanded clarity. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees and cast long shadows across the backyard, Daniel stood beside me on the porch. He did not reach for my hand immediately. He simply stood there. The silence between us felt different now. Not tense. Not fragile. Just honest. I understood that reconciliation was not a return to who we had been. It was an agreement to move forward under new terms. And whether those terms ultimately led us together or apart, one truth remained steady. I was no longer waiting to be chosen. I had already chosen myself. It has been 4 months since Daniel first walked back through the front door with lilies in his hand and uncertainty in his voice. The season has shifted fully now, the maple tree in our front yard shedding red and gold leaves that gather along the edge of the driveway. Change, I have learned, does not announce itself with fireworks. It settles in quietly, in routines that feel steady instead of fragile. Daniel has been consistent. Counseling sessions every Thursday at 10 in the morning. Shared access to every financial account. Open conversations that do not end in defensiveness. I have watched closely, not as a detective, but as a partner evaluating whether trust can grow where it once fractured. Some evenings we sit at the kitchen table reviewing retirement projections and long-term plans. He does not rush through the numbers anymore. He explains them patiently, and when I ask questions, he answers without irritation. Other nights we walk around the neighborhood just after dinner, the air cool against our skin, our steps not perfectly synchronized yet, but no longer strained. Rebuilding has not been dramatic. There have been awkward moments. There have been reminders of the months he was gone. But there has also been effort. And effort, sustained over time, carries weight. Last week, during counseling, the therapist asked if I felt safe in the marriage again. I paused before answering. Safety, I realized, no longer meant certainty about his behavior. It meant certainty about my response. I told her that I felt capable. Capable of staying if respect remained consistent. Capable of leaving if it did not. That is a different kind of safety. Daniel listened carefully when I said that. He did not argue. He nodded slowly, understanding that my strength was not a threat. It was a boundary. At home, the draft petition for divorce still rests in my nightstand drawer. I have not needed to open it in weeks, but I have not discarded it either. It represents choice. And choice has changed the way I stand in this house. A few days ago, Daniel suggested we repaint the guest room together, turning it into a small study where we can both work. Months ago, that room symbolized distance. Now it feels like potential. We spent Saturday morning moving furniture and selecting a soft gray paint from the hardware store 3 miles away. The work was simple. Rollers against drywall. Drop cloth spread neatly across the floor. We moved carefully around each other, occasionally brushing hands without hesitation. There was no grand declaration of forgiveness. No dramatic apology repeated for emphasis. Just steady cooperation. As the afternoon light filtered through the windows, illuminating fresh paint drying on the walls, I felt something settle inside me. Not the naive certainty of a younger woman who believed love alone could carry everything. Something more measured. More grounded. Daniel once believed he could leave, explore, and return to the same version of me he had left behind. What he returned to instead was a woman who had studied bank statements, consulted attorneys, and learned the language of her own independence. Whether our marriage continues for another decade or changes course again, that knowledge will remain. Tonight, as I stand on the back porch watching the last leaves fall into the yard, Daniel steps beside me. He does not speak immediately. He simply stands there, present. The silence feels honest. I understand now that his message months ago was not the turning point. My response was. He said he was ready to be a real husband. I discovered I was ready to be fully myself. And that has made all the difference.